All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're unpacking a really specific and pretty influential online perspective on the unwritten rules of modern dating. We're going to break down a worldview that sees relationships less as simple romance and more as a pretty complex game of strategy, power, and, of course, communication.
In this quote right here, it really gets to the absolute core of the philosophy we're exploring. It suggests that communication isn't necessarily for connection, but for gathering intel, information that you can then leverage. It's a pretty provocative idea, right? So let's unpack exactly how this worldview is pieced together.
So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the basic idea of dating as a game. Then we'll get into that alleged communication gap. From there, we'll look at the power theory behind it, decode these so-called tests, lay out the winning strategy, and finally, we'll examine the evolutionary argument that holds this whole thing up.
Okay, first up, the unspoken dating game. So the foundational idea from this source is that dating operates on a set of rules that no one ever tells you about. And, according to this perspective, men are often at a huge disadvantage because, well, they don't even realize a game is being played in the first place.
And we're not just talking about a simple misunderstanding here. No, the source argues that men and women are basically speaking two completely different languages. The argument is that men tend to take things literally, while women operate on a whole other level of subtext. So it's less a difference in style and more like a fundamental clash of communication systems.
So, how does this communication gap actually play out in the real world? That brings us to our second section, words versus subtext. This is where we get into the nitty-gritty of what is said versus what is, supposedly, actually meant.
Okay, this slide really breaks it down with some classic examples, according to the source. So a guy might just hear a statement of fact, but what's allegedly being communicated is some kind of test. For instance, my ex texted me isn't just sharing information, it's supposedly a test to see if you'll get jealous or insecure. I have a cold is seen not just as a complaint, but as a test of your ability to be a proactive caretaker. And I'm confused is presented as a tactic to keep you on the hook without having to commit.
So you might be asking yourself, why? Why would this dynamic even exist? Well, Section 3 introduces the theory that the source uses as its main explanation, a game of power, and it all centers on this concept of hypergamy.
And this brings us to a really crucial question posed by this worldview. I mean, if men are traditionally seen as the ones who pursue, why does this source insist that women are the ultimate selectors in the dating market? The answer, they say, is all in their interpretation of mating strategy.
And here is that key term, hypergamy. In this context, it's defined as a woman's innate, almost biological drive to mate up, to find the highest status, most powerful partner that she possibly can. This instinct, the source claims, is what makes women so selective, and it's the real engine driving this whole game.
So just how selective are we talking? The source material brings up this number a lot, 20%. The argument goes that because of hypergamy, the vast majority of women are all competing for a very small pool of men at the absolute top. This, of course, creates this incredibly competitive dynamic, and from this viewpoint, it totally explains the need for all this constant filtering and testing of potential partners.
And that leads us right into Section 4, decoding female tests. If women are trying to identify who's in that top 20%, what specific methods do they supposedly use? This is where we'll look at the practical challenges a man is expected to face.
So here are some of the really specific tests the source describes. It claims that crying might not just be about sadness, but it could be a way to see if a partner will submit to emotional pressure. Mentioning other guys is framed as a way to check your confidence. Challenging your memory of something that happened is seen as a test of who controls the narrative. And expecting you to know what she needs without being told, well, that's presented as a major test of attentiveness.
Okay, so if dating is presented as this game that's just full of tests, then what's the winning strategy? Well, that's what Section 5 is all about. Here, we're going to look at the source's proposed playbook for how to navigate this pretty complex world.
So the source lays out this 4-step strategy. First, be precise. Don't get dragged into long, emotional arguments you're supposedly destined to lose. Second, control the narrative. Don't let your version of events get twisted. Third, and this is key, the source stresses that a woman wants you to pass these tests to prove you're strong. And finally, it all comes back to that opening quote. Read her subtext, not to blindly obey it, but to understand the game and use that knowledge to your advantage.
But what's the ultimate why behind all this? Why does this source believe these dynamics are just the way things are? That brings us to our final section, the evolutionary take.
So here's the final piece of the puzzle.
The source's ultimate argument is that none of this is a conscious choice. The claim is that it has nothing to do with modern culture, but that it's all about unchangeable biological instinct. From this perspective, these so-called games and tests are just the modern-day version of ancient mating rituals, all hardwired into our DNA, all driven by the evolutionary need to pick the strongest possible mate.
And that leaves us with the central question this whole worldview is built around. Is dating, at its very core, an evolutionary power game? And if it is, what are these rules that you're just expected to know? It's a compelling and definitely a controversial way to look at human relationships, and it certainly gives you a lot to think about. Thanks for tuning in.